On the morning of March 20th, 1995, Tokyo looked like any modern city you and I have ever known. Rush hour, subway trains packed tight with people, dark suits, leather briefcases, lunchboxes, tiny earphones, someone reading a newspaper, someone trying to grab a quick nap before a long day at the office. If you've ever stood in a train car in New York or Chicago, you know that feeling very well. Crowded, exhausting, but absolutely safe. At least, that's what you think. Then, on 7 different train cars, almost at the same time, that normal shattered. A few small plastic bags were placed on the floor, crushed hard under heels. Clear liquid leaked out, colorless, almost invisible. Only a few minutes later, people's eyes began to sting. Their throats burned, their lungs seized up. Some tried to stand up, but their legs would not obey. Some collapsed between 2 plastic seats, neckties hanging off to one side. Station staff rushed in to pull each body out of the cars, without themselves yet understanding that they were walking into a lethal cloud. The cold numbers announced afterward were 13 dead and more than 6,000 affected. But behind each number is a family. A dinner table with 1 chair missing. A child waiting at the school gate who keeps waiting. This was not a battlefield. This was the morning commute, in one of the safest and most disciplined cities in the world. And yet, in just a few minutes, a subway line turned into a laboratory for chemical weapons. The most frightening thing is that the man who ordered that attack was not on the trains at all. He did not see the scene of chaos, did not have to carry anyone who was dying out of a car. He was sitting in a closed room, calling himself an enlightened guru, believing he had a mission to save the world by exterminating those who deserved to die. Born with the name Chizuo Matsumoto, later renaming himself Shoko Asahara, he built Aum Shinrikyo into an apocalyptic cult, mixing meditation, mysticism, and an obsession with destruction. This video does not only ask what happened in Tokyo that morning. The deeper, more uncomfortable question is this: how could a visually impaired child, growing up in poverty in provincial Japan, turn engineers, doctors, and elite students into instruments to carry toxic gas onto the subway? And more importantly, what do we, the people living in cities that seem safe, have to learn so that there will never be a second Shoko Asahara? This video aims to analyze one of the worst terrorist attacks in Japan's history. We do not support or romanticize any extremist organization or act of violence. To understand why a cult like Aum Shinrikyo could spring up right in the middle of Tokyo, we have to step back and look at the mood of an entire country. On the surface, Japan in the 1980s and early 1990s was a success story admired by the whole world. Miraculous growth, cars, electronics, skyscrapers, trains arriving to the minute. But beneath that shiny glass surface, there was a sense of exhaustion that many of us might recognize. After World War II, an entire society was rebuilt on discipline, selfless work, and putting the collective above the individual. Men in black suits with briefcases became salarymen who spent their whole lives in offices. Women carried the pressure of family and children. By the late 1980s, the economic bubble swelled and then burst in the early 1990s, bringing with it anxiety about jobs and the future. Rates of depression, suicide, and feelings of mental exhaustion rose. People lived in a modern city, but inside, many felt empty. In that context, a young generation grew up with 2 parallel images. On one side, a Japan that was rich, clean, and efficient. On the other, a schedule packed with cramped schools, sleepless exam nights, and endless working hours. If you've ever raced with overwork culture in the US, you'll understand part of it. It is the feeling that your life is defined by performance and productivity, not by meaning. It's no surprise that in those years Japan saw an explosive wave of new religions, meditation groups, yoga, spirituality circles. They promised what companies or schools could not give: meaning, peace, and life. A community that listens. Many educated people. Engineers, elite university students, not weak people, turned to breathing classes, talks on enlightenment and karma as a way to escape pressure while still keeping a respectable image. But if you put yourself in the place of a young Japanese person back then, lonely in a small rented room, commuting by train every day, not daring to tell anyone about your despair, then the promise of a pure community, of a higher spiritual path, suddenly becomes very attractive. It was precisely into that spiritual emptiness that people like Shoko Asahara stepped. Not with guns or bombs right away, but with the promise of healing and salvation. And that is always the most dangerous beginning. Shoko Asahara, born Matsumoto Chizuo, was born on March 2, 1955, into a tatami mat-making family in Kumamoto Prefecture. Many children, little money. From an early age he had an eye disease and could only see very poorly. In a society that values norms and productivity like Japan, being visually impaired meant that his future path was almost predetermined. Not a doctor, not an engineer. Most likely massage, acupuncture, a traditional occupation reserved for the blind. As a child, he was sent to a boarding school for visually impaired children. This is an important detail. In that environment, children who were completely blind had to depend on others for almost everything. Chizuo, however, because he still had partial sight, stood in a position half inside, half outside. Documents and accounts show that he quickly learned how to exploit that advantage, pushing around classmates, bullying them, collecting money. He was not only the pitiful boy who was bullied, but someone who learned very quickly how to use power within a small system. We often look at people with disabilities through the lens of compassion. Here, the picture is much more complicated. Both victim and perpetrator exist in the same person. A teenager living with the feeling of being excluded by society, yet tasting the sweetness of controlling others within the small circle around him. It was an early and distorted lesson in power. After graduating, Chizuo did not get into university as he had hoped. He moved to Tokyo, studied and practiced acupuncture, and sold expensive traditional medicines. Here we see a recurring pattern that would later be amplified in Aum Shinrikyo. On the outside, it was healing, healthcare, helping people. On the inside, it was the ambition to make money, to control, to build a small circle of followers revolving around himself. At the same time, he plunged into the world of religion and spirituality, reading Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, astrology, occultism, and even apocalyptic prophecies in the style of Nostradamus. Many researchers believe that it was precisely in this period that a visually impaired boy, burdened with a sense of inferiority, found something very dangerous in religious language. The story of the chosen one, the one with special enlightenment, the one who leads others. For someone who had always felt left behind, being convinced that he carried a mission greater than an ordinary life was a terrifying pull. When we put all those pieces together, we no longer see a monster appearing out of nowhere. Instead, we see a very human trajectory: poverty, disability, limitation, and then a longing to compensate with power and adulation. The uncomfortable question for all of us is this: at how many points along that journey did society miss the opportunity to intervene, to provide support, or at least to set healthy boundaries, before a boy who could barely see became the man who led an entire cult into darkness? Once he had gathered enough feelings of inferiority, ambition, and an obsession with being worshipped, Shoko Asahara's next step was to find a worthy stage. That stage was Tokyo in the 1980s. A city packed with people who were tired, stressed, and searching for something beyond paychecks and overtime hours. In a small corner, Asahara opened an acupuncture clinic, sold traditional medicine, and then gradually turned it into yoga classes, meditation, and human potential development sessions. At first glance, everything looked harmless. A middle-aged man with long hair, wearing a white robe, guiding deep breathing, talking about karma, liberation, and how to slow down in a society that was running too fast. Many of the first students were very ordinary people: office workers, housewives, students. They said they felt more relaxed, slept better, and felt as if, finally someone is listening to me. That is a very human need that any industrial society is familiar with. But Asahara did not stop at being a kind yoga teacher. He built up an image of himself as an enlightened master with supernatural powers. Photos of him levitating in a meditation pose were circulated, along with lectures about spiritual experiences in the Himalayas, about meeting Hindu masters, about a mission to save humanity. In 1984, he formed his first practice group, and by 1987, his organization was officially recognized as a religion under the name Aum Shinrikyo, like a legal stamp for ambitions that were swelling day by day. What is noteworthy is that those who flocked to Aum were not only people who were easily deceived. There were many students and engineers from Japan's top universities. Young people who were good at their studies, proficient in science, but felt that science and modern society could not answer the question, "What am I living for?" Asahara hit that gap exactly. He said that only he could reconcile modern science and spiritual truth. Only he understood quantum physics and karma, chemistry and liberation. He called them the chosen ones, forming the vanguard to save Japan from decadence. From then on, the meditation classes were no longer just a place to relax. They became the doorway into a new world, with its own language, its own rituals, its own logic. Members were encouraged to move into the community, cut back contact with their families, devote their money, time, and future. They wore strange devices on their heads, being told that this was how to synchronize their brainwaves with the guru. They listened over and over to sermons, saying that the outside world was rotting, that only Aum was the sole boat when the great flood came. From the outside, we can immediately see the red flags. Concentrating power in one individual. Separating members from their families. The language of only we are right, the whole world is wrong. But the dangerous thing is that this slide happened very gradually. Today, it's just a yoga class after work. Tomorrow, it's a weekend retreat. And then comes the moment when you wake up in a community where every decision, from what to eat, what to think, to whether you should leave or not, revolves around one man who claims to be enlightened. The journey of founding Aum, therefore, is not just the story of a manipulator appearing. It is the meeting between an individual craving absolute power and a society full of tired, lonely people searching for meaning. When those very human needs are not addressed in a healthy way, the promise of total salvation from a guru like Asahara suddenly becomes a doorway that is both seductive and leads straight into the abyss. And that is precisely the psychological foundation before Aum entered its radicalized and militarized phase under him. When a community has come to believe that only they hold the truth, the next downward step usually looks very similar. They begin to believe that everything outside that truth is impure, is a threat. For Aum, the turning point was not only psychological, but also a dangerous mixture of distorted doctrine and modern technology. In the early 1990s, Asahara no longer talked much about yoga as a way to reduce stress. He began preaching more about the end of the world, about the coming nuclear war, about Japan sinking into chaos. His sermons were recorded and played over and over. The outside world was described as a place that was beyond saving. In that setting, Aum proclaimed itself to be Noah's Ark, the only one that could save worthy souls. From there, a frightening concept was born inside Aum. Asahara called it a kind of salvation by killing. The idea was this: if someone opposed Aum, if they blasphemed the guru, then they were accumulating bad karma to the point that they would fall into hell. Therefore, killing them before they committed further sins, on paper, was actually an act of compassion. It was a very sophisticated way of inverting morality. Even the elimination of enemies was labeled as saving people. Meanwhile, scientifically skilled disciples were given ever more advanced tasks. Aum set up laboratories, bought equipment and chemicals, and even sent people abroad to research biological and chemical weapons. Those who had studied chemistry, physics, or biology at prestigious schools were told that they were using their knowledge for a purpose higher than any company. They were not just employees, but warriors in a global spiritual war. The distance between the laboratory and the battlefield grew increasingly thin. According to later official investigations, Aum researched many kinds of agents, from botulinum to anthrax, although most of the experiments failed. But the effort showed one thing. This was no longer a cult that only talked idly about the end of the world. They were actively seeking tools that could turn gloomy prophecies into reality on the ground. At the same time, violence inside the organization also escalated. Members who wanted to leave, those who asked questions, those who cooperated with outside lawyers, began to disappear. Lawyer Tsutsumi Sakamoto, who publicly criticized Aum and helped families get their children back, was murdered along with his wife and young son in 1989. From an outside perspective, this is the point where every alarm bell should have gone off. A group that called itself spiritual yet was willing to kill an entire family to silence them. The Japanese state at that time reacted slowly and awkwardly. Partly because the law strongly protected freedom of religion after World War II. Partly because Aum always wore meditation robes and spoke the language of enlightenment, not resembling the kinds of terrorist groups the security services were used to dealing with. When accusations surfaced, they were treated as religious disputes, not as a national security threat. In the eyes of believers, every time was criticized by the press, every time the police investigated, it was interpreted as further proof that the world is attacking the truth. The siege mentality made them cling even more tightly to the cult. The sermons gradually shifted into the language of war. The outside world was the forces of demons. Aum was the army of light. And once they had declared themselves the army of truth, possessing weapons of mass destruction was no longer unthinkable. Looking back at this radicalization phase, the frightening thing is not that one day Asahara suddenly woke up and decided to poison Tokyo. What is frightening is how he led an entire community step by tiny step. From yoga to enlightenment, from enlightenment to a sense of superiority, from superiority to persecution, from persecution to the justness of war. And at the bottom of that slope were secret laboratories, white-coated engineers producing sarin, and the belief that killing people could be wrapped and presented as an act of salvation. For us, people living in modern societies that pride themselves on being rational, this part of the story is a powerful reminder. Science in itself does not protect us from extremism. When knowledge and technology fall into the hands of people living inside a bubble of distorted doctrine, they can become tools to turn ideology into disasters that are very concrete, very physical. Just like what Tokyo had to witness in 1995. When talking about the crimes of this cult, there are two images you can hardly forget if you have ever read the investigation files. One is the rows of concrete buildings at the foot of Mount Fuji, where industrial machines, steel pipes, and chemical reaction tanks operated like a miniature chemical weapons factory. The other is the 7 train cars packed with people at rush hour in Tokyo, where invisible poison gas seeped into the lungs of people who were only trying to get to work on time. Those two worlds that seemed unrelated were connected by a single word: orders. In the early 1990s, Aum turned its facility in Kamikurishiki into a research and chemical production complex, with buildings given very religious-sounding names, but housing production lines for sarin, VX, and other nerve agents inside. Engineers and chemists trained at Japan's top universities were drawn in, persuaded that they were serving a mission to save the world. In reality, they were building a chemical weapons arsenal whose scale would make many countries wary. Before Tokyo became the target, the cult had already conducted a rehearsal elsewhere. On the night of June 27, 1994, in the city of Matsumoto, Nagano, a modified truck quietly released aerosolized sarin into a residential area near where judges were hearing a case involving Aum. 8 people died and more than 500 were injured. At first, the police suspected a local resident, even though he and his family were themselves victims. For many months, society as a whole had no idea that this was a test attack by a cult that had decided to use chemical weapons on its own soil. In parallel with sarin, Aum also secretly used VX, one of the most powerful nerve agents in the world. In late 1994 and early 1995, cult members attacked multiple targets they considered traitors, including at least one victim who had VX dripped onto the back of his neck right on a street in Osaka, collapsing and dying after many days in a coma. It was one of the first recorded VX fatalities in the world, and it did not occur in wartime. but in the middle of a Japanese city that was peaceful on paper. Then came Monday morning, March 20th, 1995. 5 groups of Aum members carrying plastic bags filled with liquid sarin, wrapped in newspaper, boarded different trains on the Tokyo subway system, all passing through the Kasumigaseki and Nagatacho areas, where the government ministries and parliament are located. At the peak of rush hour, they placed the bags on the floor, stabbed them with sharpened umbrella tips, and quietly stepped out of the cars. Within minutes, a strange smell, stinging eyes, and difficulty breathing spread. But no one had time to understand what was happening. We can imagine, but it is hard to fully feel, the scene that followed. Passengers collapsed on the platforms. Station staff tried to pull people out of the cars without any protective gear. Ambulances crowded the center of Tokyo. Hospitals received thousands of patients in just a few hours. Many doctors at first thought it was an industrial gas leak or ordinary poisoning, while the nerve agent continued to destroy patients' nervous systems. The final result: 13 people killed, more than 6,000 injured, or left with long-term health effects, and a city that had prided itself on order and safety was forced to confront its own fragility. What made this attack particularly terrifying, especially for us looking back from distant democratic societies, was not only the number of victims, but the way it struck directly at the most basic belief: that public space, the morning train, your commute to work, is a default safe place. Aum turned an entire public transport system into an open-air laboratory, where passengers were turned into test subjects for an apocalyptic war that existed only in the guru's mind. In the later trials, many details emerged showing that this was not a spontaneous act. There had been test runs, technical failures, meetings to design targets in order to maximize the death toll and paralyze the state apparatus. That raises a sharp question. How could an organization draped in spirituality and enlightenment go so far as to run a chemical weapons program, plan the mass killing of innocent civilians, and still operate for many years without being stopped? Those questions lead us to the years of investigation and trials that stretched on for nearly a decade. When you rewatch the footage from 1995, there's one moment that repeats again and again on the screen. Rows of concrete buildings at the foot of Mount Fuji, Japanese special police vehicles surrounding them, helicopters circling in the sky, and then a shaggy, unkempt man being led out of a gray corrugated metal building. It was May 16th, 1995, less than 2 months after the sarin attack on the Tokyo subway, when police raided Aum Shinrikyo's complex in Kamikushiki and arrested the man whose name the entire country already knew, but whose brutality they did not yet fully grasp. From that moment on, the enlightened guru was no longer seen on colorful posters or in surreal lecture halls. He appeared behind the thick glass of a prisoner transport van, behind the bars of a detention center, and then inside a glass box in the Tokyo courtroom. The trials began in 1996 and lasted nearly a decade. Prosecutors accused him of ordering a series of crimes, from the 1994 sarin attack in Matsumoto, the 1995 subway sarin attack, to the kidnappings and murders of people who dared to leave the cult, or simply dared to ask questions. For people living in the United States, used to loud trials and wall-to-wall media coverage, there was something very different about how Japan handled this case. No sensational talk shows every night, no spittle-flying shouting matches on television. Just a society that values order, patiently lining up to enter the courtroom, listening to each piece of chemical evidence, each victim's testimony, each detail of how a cult had turned scientific knowledge and religious language into weapons. In 2004, the court sentenced Shoko Asahara to death. In 2006, the Supreme Court upheld the ruling. Throughout the years on death row, he was almost silent, rarely answering interrogations, leaving an uncomfortable void for the victims and for those who study violent extremism. We will never hear a clear confession or an honest explanation of why he ordered people to be killed with poison gas at rush hour. On July 6, 2018, More than 23 years after the attack, Japan's Ministry of Justice announced that Asahara had been executed by hanging, along with 6 other senior Aum leaders. A few weeks later, the remaining 6 death row inmates in the Aum case were also executed. In total, he and his accomplices were convicted of causing the deaths of at least 29 people in multiple attacks, and injuring and leaving lasting harm to thousands. On paper, the story seems to end there. But even after the guru was taken to the gallows, the shadow of Aum Shinrikyo did not disappear entirely. Since 2000, the organization has renamed itself Aleph, then split into several smaller factions, still operating under tight surveillance by Japanese security agencies, with hundreds, even more than 1,000 followers remaining. Many victims to this day have still not received the full compensation the courts ordered. Looking back, the image of Shoko Asahara in a glass cage in court, then disappearing into a brief execution notice, is a very Japanese symbol of how a society tries to deal with extreme evil. Justice finally arrived, but it could not reverse those terrifying minutes on the Tokyo subway, nor could it erase the much more haunting question: how could a modern, educated society allow a man like that to go so far? When we look back at the whole story, the most frightening thing is not just an individual with the title of guru, but the social gaps that gave him a place to stand. A generation that is lonely, stressed, searching for meaning. A state that hesitates in the face of warnings. An education system that is excellent at technical training, but teaches far too little about critical thinking and ethical responsibility. If there is one lesson for us today, it is this: wherever there is a sense of alienation, injustice, and loss of direction, that is where potential Asaharas can emerge. It does not have to be a cult. It can be conspiracy theories, extremist discourse online, closed communities that believe only they possess the truth. Therefore, fighting extremism is not only a matter for the police or intelligence services. It is about building healthier communities, listening to the vulnerable earlier, teaching young people to be healthily skeptical of every promise of absolute salvation. If you find stories like this important, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share the video. That helps us continue to tell these difficult but necessary stories.